So today I want to go over some stretches. Somebody asked me last week to recommend a few different leg stretches. So I'm going to start today with the hip flexor stretch. I'm having to record this at my flat, so apologies for the extra clutter in here today. So I really think hip flexor stretching is super important. I think a lot of people tend to, because we're always moving in this forward direction, either sitting at desks or running or cycling, people tend to really overwork in the hip flexor area. So opening up the hip flexors is so important just for lower back health and also general hip health. So I want to go over the hip flexor stretch. You're going to kneel onto something padded. I'm using a nice big foamy block. But obviously just using a rolled up mat is absolutely fine. And just very simply step forwards. I'm just going to show this to you and just go over a few key cues that are so important for doing this effectively. I'll try and shift back so I don't cut off my head here. Okay, so you lengthen the front leg out to begin with, and try to derotate the pelvis. The chances are that you're going to need to hold on to something whilst you do this, because there's a little bit of a balance issue generally. And you want to think of drawing the front thigh bone into the back of the hip so that both hip bones are really square to the front. The other thing to avoid is having that front leg out to the side. So just make sure it's forward. My toes naturally drop to the floor, but it's absolutely fine to have your toes off. It's a bit harder to balance. And then you bend your front knee and you shift forwards. So this is the simple movement here, which you're all pretty familiar with. So once you're coming forwards, don't go all the way down as far as you can go. You're going to think of drawing I'm going to talk with my right leg here. I'm going to think of drawing my right thigh bone up into my hip joint. The tendency is, when people have two different tendencies in this movement, either they arch into the lower back and go, I can't feel any stretch here, and it's just because you've taken all that movement into the lower back. Or people overcompensate and go into this sort of tucked under position. And I've realised that this is a little bit of my tendency as well, mostly because I'm in class and I'm constantly trying to get people out of the lower back. But this position really does not respect the natural alignment in the hip joint. It almost kind of pushes the thigh bone out of the hip, which is really not very healthy. So what you want to do is really respect that space in the hip joint. Don't tuck or tilt the pelvis. Just keep it nice and centered. So the tailbone is just pointing down, not forwards, not backwards. And you're just thinking, as you drop forwards, of connecting the thigh bone into the hip joint along that line of the psoas muscle, here it is again, so that we open the front of the hip without hyperextending. So the problem with tucking under is that it has this effect of almost overstretching the front of the hip, which really isn't healthy. And I've done this stretch in the past where it's actually gone into so much hyperextension that I get up and I can't walk because I've overstretched the hip. So that's not a good thing. Now, some people are very particular about this idea of having the knee directly over the ankle so you don't overflex the knee. I'm not so fussy about that. I actually think it's good to flex the knee. It's important for the knee joint. But just be aware of that alignment, so try not to push the knee out to the side. I prefer to think of this sense of drawing the thigh bone into the hip joint and connecting. Now, there are two options. As you can see, for me, I'm going quite low. I can either bring my hands to the floor and try and take it into a low lunge, taking the breastbone forwards. This is only possible for me properly on this side. The other leg is a little bit harder. So the other option is just to remain in a more upright position and thinking of drawing up. And generally, the more flexible you are, the more you want to think of lifting out of the pelvis rather than just collapsing as deep as you can go into the hip flexor stretch. And I'm just going to take a slight variation here, which is a little bit of a side version to get a little more into the adductor area on the inner thigh. And you just take so all I've done is from this position, I've rotated about 45 degrees to the side, and now I'm going to bend that front knee again and go forwards. Again, I'm really thinking of drawing up through that deep psoas area. So I'm not just collapsing into the pelvis, but I'm lifting out of it as I sink forwards. And now this is either going to stretch very strongly in the front leg, or it's going to come more into the back thigh. It depends on where the tightness is for you, and then coming out of that. And then we go on to the other side, and you'll see there's a huge difference to me from one side to the other. So we're going to I'm going to step my right leg forwards now. Again, square the pelvis and bending that right knee as I come forwards. I immediately want to think of drawing out of that hip as I shift into the hip flexor stretch, and really connecting up through that deep front line. And I'm either going to stay here and just push out of it a little bit and push in. Generally, I prefer these movements, so you're not just holding a stretch, but you're pressing away and forwards. It feels a little more functional. Or you can try bringing your hands to the floor. Oh, that's actually not as bad as it has been. And you're going to lift the breastbone forward. So you just try and come into a little bit of a back extension. And then pressing away. And then come out and do a 45-degree turn away from your front leg. Watch as your hip is not lifting up on that side. So you want to square off your pelvis. Make sure your hip bones are level as you shift forwards. And again, I quite like taking this knee into full flexion. There's nothing wrong with taking the knee into flexion. Obviously, if you don't have the mobility in the knee, that's a different matter. So you just go to the point that feels comfortable for it. And you just want to get a stretch. It could be either in the back leg or in the front leg. So it just really depends on where your tightness is. And then we press out of that. And then releasing and dropping the pelvis into a kneeling position. So the next exercise I'll go through is the calf muscles.